What would happen if the artwork on your classroom walls became the catalyst for real communication in the target language? In this episode, I'm joined by Spanish teacher Courtney Bonino to explore how adding art to your curriculum can transform engagement and deepen proficiency. We talk about why art is such a powerful entry point for learners at different levels, how to integrate it into your units you already teach without adding prep time, and how to keep the focus on meaningful communication. You're going to get some practical ideas you can try right away that spark curiosity, engagement, and confidence in your language students. So let's jump in. Whether you're planning your first lesson or celebrating your 20th year in the language classroom, I understand exactly where you are. I'm Joshua Cabral, and I'm also a language teacher in my 29th year of teaching. Now, I also have the opportunity to support schools and teachers all across the country who are working towards increasing proficiency and building confidence in their students. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast, with over 200 episodes of practical strategies tested in real classrooms just like yours and mine. So let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and you know that I know that you are an incredible language teacher because you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. You're going the extra mile, looking at your teaching, being introspective, looking for new ideas, seeing that you're right on the right track. All of those things are just really impressive. And so thank you for taking the time out of your week to join me here on the podcast. And as you're thinking about new ideas, I have one for you today, and we're going to be talking about adding art to your curriculum and then maybe even eventually turning your classroom into an art gallery. Now, this is not something I have personally done to that scale in my classroom. So I needed to bring someone on who can help us understand this and see how to do it. And the teacher joining me today is Courtney Bonino, and she is in Pennsylvania, and she had spent a number of years teaching Spanish in New Jersey before going to Pennsylvania. And she is currently working with World of Learning, which is an online learning platform. And I'll let her talk a little bit more about what that is, but you may have seen her at Devin Gunning's Practical and Comprehensible Online Conference and at ACTFL. I actually have had the pleasure of being in an ACTFL session that she presented back in Philadelphia a couple of years back. But welcome to the podcast, Courtney. It is so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I am very honored to be here. And I'm very excited to talk with you and everybody today about art in the classroom.
So I had mentioned that you recently transitioned to working for an online learning platform. So could you give us just a little bit of detail about what that means and what that looks like in the world of education?
Absolutely. So prior to that, I was teaching in person at a school in New Jersey. I taught middle school for 1 year, high school for about 6 years, and then transferred to the World of Learning Institute. And we are an online school that supports schools all around, especially the East Coast, that can't find a teacher. Maybe they're in a rural area. They can't find a Latin teacher, but they want to offer Latin. Or this teacher shortage is causing them trouble finding sufficient Spanish teachers. So they reach out to us and we provide classes for them that are live and keep their kids involved in world languages.
Such a great resource for schools that find themselves in that bind, whether it's a funding issue or finding teachers. That's really an exciting opportunity to provide to these school districts. So I'm ready to jump into all things art. Are you on board?
I'm ready to go.
Okay. So I always like to start with a good old-fashioned why. We're looking at using art in our classroom. Why is art such an effective entry point for language learning, especially for engaging students at different proficiency levels? So why is art that great entry point for students?
I would say that art is all visual. It's a visual language, right? So you have a class of students that are all at different levels, even if you're Spanish 1. Some students are going to understand everything you're saying. Some are not going to understand anything. But art, they're all on the same page. They're all looking at art, Doesn't matter if they understand you. So it's a blank slate for everybody. It helps them to get on the same page with you.
So when we talk about students being on the same page, what does that mean to you to say that students are arriving to a piece of art on the same page?
Especially in a world language classroom, because it's not an art class, you're not expecting them to understand the art and to interpret it for exactly what it means. But we're using it as a tool for communication. So as long as they're able to say, oh, I see a girl. That color is blue. Blue could mean calm. We're all looking at something that we all know what it is.
Mm-hmm. So you're using it as a tool for, say, comprehensible input, where students are coming from that same standpoint when it comes to using the art as their point of understanding. So I really like that. And before we get into the nitty gritty and the details and the activities and what it looks like, could you share with us just real quickly a moment when you saw student engagement with language and using art, their understanding or their proficiency, that you saw a shift, that it was really this piece of art or this activity had a great effect on them in the classroom?
Yeah, I think I was teaching Spanish 3 and we had a whole third of the year to devote to art. And I was like, okay, I have to make this count. So before I even started the unit and dove into these artists, I chose to take time to devote to art vocabulary. And so I came up with this long list of words like dark colors or background and foreground and theme, because if you don't start with that, they're not going to have anything in the target language. So I purchased these really large whiteboards from Home Depot. They were about 2 by 3 feet, and I had like 6 of them around the room. And I taped different paintings to those boards, but paintings that they already knew, Starry Night, Mona Lisa. So they were like, oh, I recognize that. This isn't foreign to me. And I asked them to do a silent gallery walk. I said, there's no talking, even in a language classroom. We're not talking. And I gave them each a dry erase marker. I asked them to walk around and just maybe list what they saw in the painting. We did that round. I said, okay, now let's write, how does it make you feel? Then maybe another round was, what questions do you have about this painting? But then came the language part. I said, okay, now we're still quiet, but I want you to respond to questions that your classmates wrote on there. And the responses were really intriguing. Like they really took care of reading their responses and answering with thought, thinking more about the art. So it was a combination of providing them the vocab, of showing them art that they knew and already were familiar with, but also being silent in a language classroom helped them to eliminate any side conversations and distractions.
So I like the idea of already bringing in all of the modes. Like they were writing and then they were reading what their classmates wrote and then writing themselves. And I'm sure we're going to get into talking about and discussing paintings. So I can already see that you're bringing in all of the modes, because sometimes we can think, oh, it's one mode that you're going to stick to. So I love that. And I want to jump back to when you talked about presenting them with the vocabulary. And when you're doing this, do you have that vocabulary up around the room? Do you provide it in a chat mat? So how are students maintaining or keeping their access to that vocabulary as they're engaging?
For this unit specifically, came up with a pretty lengthy list because no 2 artworks that you look at will require the same words. Think about a Picasso Guernica and a Frida Kahlo self-portrait. You need completely different words for that. So I let them have a worksheet with them, just a vocab list, pretty much through the whole unit. Because my job wasn't to assess them, do you know all these words? I wanted to see how they could use them and if they could talk about that art using those words. So I let them have the paper.
I think that having those resources are really helpful. I even think when we talk about an interpersonal conversation, that we think that we want it to be spontaneous. And yes, we want it to be spontaneous, but I always make the distinction that spontaneous means that it is unscripted. It doesn't mean that it's unsupported. Right. So when they're talking about it and they have the support, the spontaneity comes in the words that they're choosing from the support that you're giving them. So I like that idea also of having the different vocabulary based on the different works of art. I hadn't thought about that. I was assuming they have the same vocabulary they're going to use for everything. So what are some ideas of, just from your personal experience, like a particular set of vocabulary that was needed for a particular painting? Like you mentioned a couple already, but what were some where, oh, here's going to be an interesting word that's specific to this painting that we're looking for? Just some interesting ideas about that.
That's a good one. I remember we were doing a describe and draw info gap. where students could see the painting, but their classmate couldn't. And it was Salvador Dali. So there's things floating through the air. There's things that don't look anything like they should. And I remember specifically, it was like, I had to remake my list. I had to give a separate list for that day. I was adding things to the board, words like floating, whimsical, hovering, just things that you would never have to use to describe art. But because this specific artist's work is so unique, I needed a whole separate set.
You mentioned a little bit the word unit. You said, when I do this unit. And I think that often teachers think that this is something I'm going to do in an art unit. So I'm going to do a whole unit that's just focused on art. And maybe I don't have a place for an art unit, or that doesn't come up with my specific curriculum. So for teachers who might be concerned, they like this idea, but they may be concerned that using art means creating an entirely new unit. How can teachers realistically maybe add art into the units that they already have, rather than saying, oh, this is an entire art unit? How have you done some of that?
I'm a big proponent of adding authentic cultural resources into every lesson. And I think art is one of the easiest ways to do that. Because as I said, that's your tool for communication. So oftentimes, let's take a food unit, for example. We're teaching vocabulary like fruits and vegetables. So you, as the teacher, head to Google and you search bowl of fruit or fruit basket, and you pull up whatever Google shows you. It's just a in stock image, right? It's not anything cultural. And so what if instead of that, you search for a still life by Fernando Botero? You search for a still life by an artist in your language, in your country. Suddenly, it's the exact same image, but it's now an art form. It's now some sort of Hispanic or whatever culture. That cultural input is there. So take the still life with fruits and vegetables. You could talk about prepositions. Where's the apple? Is it to the left or right? Is the orange bigger or smaller than the lemon? You can do the same thing with people, with descriptions of physical traits. One of my favorite artists, for Spanish teachers listening, is Carmen Lomas Garza. And so she shares paintings from her life and her traditions in a Mexican-American family. You'll see paintings about quinceañeras, natural healing remedies, telling stories on the porch. So I've used these images for units on celebrations, on healthy living, on past tense legends.
All kinds of possibilities to bring it into that unit that you're doing. So I hope that teachers that are listening are seeing that, oh, this doesn't have to be a full-on unit on art, but finding those ways to integrate it in there. And beyond vocabulary, using it as the vocabulary, you mentioned a little bit using it for prepositions, but have there been other grammar or language structures that you've used artwork to engage students in learning as well? Do you have any examples of those?
Yeah, I think the one that students struggle with a lot is the subjunctive, right? It's something that it's really hard to grasp. So I actually used that to structure a lot of the art lessons that I've taught. But I focused just on emotion, because if you throw all the subjunctive at your kids at once, it's a lot for them to handle. So strictly sticking to emotion, talking about this painting is sad, or this one makes me feel this way. And students were really able to understand the subjunctive when I narrowed it down to just the emotion. And we were tying it to describing how they felt about a specific piece of art.
I love that. So what are some strategies? Because I know teachers are probably getting their interest piqued and they want to try this. And so what are some strategies that you have used that allow teachers, say they have 2 or 3 different levels and you're using one piece of art. So this is a almost kind of no prep type of situation here where you can use the same type of art, but you can use it at different proficiency levels. So could you maybe talk us through novice to novice high, intermediate, mid, using the same image or maybe sculpture? I'm talking generally about art, and how you would have students engage with that piece of art at different proficiency levels.
I love this question because you really can. It's such an easy way to make it low prep for you. Your novice students are going to be looking at the art more as surface level. Like, what do I see? But you don't just have to have them list what there is. That can be boring for them. Some things that I've found really cool have been labeling the colors and doing a color mood map. So you provide them with, okay, when you see blue, it could mean calm, it could mean sad. Purple could mean royalty. So instead of just saying that's blue, they have to say blue means this. It helps them enhance their language skills a little bit. The novice students could write their own title for a painting in their own words. Using emojis is very simple for novice students, and then tying it to an adjective. So maybe they're not at the subjunctive level yet to use when they're expressing their emotions, but they can use emojis and very simple adjectives. I would say my favorite for novice students, and even intermediate students loved this one, was a scavenger hunt, where you show them a painting or a series of paintings, and they have to count, okay, how many stars are in these paintings? Can you find where the girl is or where this person is? And they have to go and find it through the painting. But when you're then going to intermediate students, and even like the novice high can get into more of the analysis, and you can provide descriptions of the artwork. They can now interpret that description. Then those intermediate students can turn that into questions. What other questions do you have? If you were to talk to the artist, what would you ask the artist? And then finally, I would say comparing and contrasting art for those intermediate students, that brings it to another level too.
So as you're engaging in these activities, do you use a common framework that you have these activities, these questions, these ways of engaging, and you can swap out different pieces of art and keep that sort of framework that can be used with any of them? Or do you find yourself changing them up for each one? Now, even if it's a framework, I understand there's going to be subtle changes, but do you use a general framework for how students engage with art in your classroom?
I always switched it up. I never like to do the same thing. I would say I always started with a biography of the artist if we were learning about a specific artist, to give background, because to understand the meaning behind the art, they need to understand where the artist is coming from. So I did always start that way. But then once I got into the art, because each artist is so unique, I tried to cater that lesson to what was specific about that artist. I do think always having paintings around the room is very helpful. So that was something I did keep consistent. Mm-hmm. What we did with those gallery walks could have been different with each artist, but that was probably my staple.
And so we had talked a little bit earlier about bringing in the different modes. And what we're talking about here, when you say compare and contrast for the intermediate level and engaging in those different ways, are you doing this through speaking activities, interpersonal? Are they doing this through writing? And I'm also thinking, when you're talking about showing the bio, is that in the target language, so the interpretive reading as well? So how are the different modes coming in? Because I just want to make sure that we're, as we say, compare and contrast, are we talking about reading? Are we talking about writing? So what does that look like in terms of all the modes?
I again tried to vary it as much as possible, because those are skills that you can do in all the modes, which makes it a little bit more fun for you and the students to not have to do the same thing over and over. So for example, with comparing and contrasting and those galleries, I would have students walk around together and have conversations. But then maybe what you could do is take those conversations and have them then write it down. What did you learn? What did you and a student talk about? The biography was mostly interpretive reading, but I would also try to find videos. If the artists that you're teaching about have been alive in recent years and there's videos of them talking, I loved showing those because students got to put a face to those artists. I remember one year I was teaching about Picasso, and when I told them what year he passed away in, they were like, "What? I thought he was from like the 1700s." I said, "No, he was alive very recently." So being able to put a face was cool. But yeah, trying to do all the modes of communication, allow them to practice that vocabulary, to talk about art in multiple ways.
Mm-hmm. And when they're going around doing the gallery walks and having the conversations that you referenced, are you providing question prompts for those conversations? How are you setting that up?
Yeah, I like to provide at least some questions to get them started. And especially for the advanced or intermediate students, you can make those questions pretty detailed and pretty analytical. I would post them next to the paintings and they could walk around and talk. Another way you can do it is assign each group a painting and let them really delve into it. Mm-hmm. That way they have time rather than having a whole class period. They've got to look at 5 paintings. No, let's just look at 1. Mm-hmm. And they can have those conversations. They can write about it. But then it's also nice to let them formulate questions. Art is very subjective, and letting them try to create their own questions is a good skill to develop. Mm-hmm. But as the teacher, I do recommend having a few to start.
Yeah, I've used a gallery walk situation, sometimes with art, sometimes other images or objects, where the whole idea was to ask questions about it, to practice the questions. And one thing that I did specifically use art for in a gallery walk with novice level students is when they were practicing weather and seasons. And so they were going around, because that was novice level memorized language that they knew so they could look at these pictures and say that this is the season, this is the weather, and I would have them, what date do you think it is? What time of day do you think it is? So it was creating this whole narrative just based on there, but I left it there. So I'm getting some more ideas from you about taking it a bit further from there.
I love that idea. The weather's a good one. I didn't think of that.
It was I knew that they had this memorized language as novice level students, so they could say I see in different objects, but then it was how could you actually get creative? And then we would say, this is the date and the weather and the time. Which one do you think it is? And look at the different ones. So that was my one foray into trying the gallery walk with art in my classroom. So to dive a little deeper into what students are doing. So when students analyze or respond to art, how can teachers make sure that communication is really staying at the forefront? Because I think that when teachers are engaging in art or watching a movie or whatever that is, but I have my curriculum and we have to grow in the proficiency levels. So how do you make sure that your communicative and your proficiency goals really stay front and center as students are engaging with art?
I would say make sure that you and your students know those can-do statements, that this is still something that we're working towards proficiency. It's not just describing art, but we're working on a goal. And if you keep reminding yourself of that, I would often show my students the can-do statements and say, hey, let's make sure we can do this. We can't do it now, but this is our goal. So that's one way to do it. Again, with that vocabulary list that I recommended, have that around. Make a word wall. Make sure that they're practicing those words so that they gain confidence and they're not afraid to try talking and to try using the language in new ways. Mm-hmm. Your goal is to make them have that confidence so that they can improve in their proficiency. Mm-hmm. And the vocab list is one easy way to do that.
And so I do have to ask this question. We do all these great activities. This is fun. This is wonderful. But when it comes to what does the assessment look like after all that? So after students have seen the bios, they've learned about it, they've talked about it, they've done comparing, they've done all these things with this art. What does that assessment piece look like after all of that?
That is a good point, because I remember planning this. My colleague and I planned a lot of this art unit together, and we got to that point and we said, what are we going to do now? Because art is hard to assess. We said, we've already shown them all these paintings. They're going to know everything about them. And we said, okay, so what if we show them art by the same artists that we talked about, but artworks that we haven't shown them yet? So we did the 5 big Hispanic artists, I would say. And on the assessment, I showed them paintings from those exact artists that they have not yet seen. And all I did was ask them, who do you think the artist is and why? And I said, even if you tell me the wrong name, the wrong artist, you won't lose points, as long as your reasoning makes sense. So that was the proficiency piece. I'm not assessing you on, do you really know who that artist is? But if you can say, oh yeah, I think that's this artist because they used a lot of cubism. They used dark colors. They had themes that represented sadness. And I would oftentimes give out full credit, even if it was not the right answer, because they used the language well. They were communicating and expressing their thoughts. And it was a valid answer.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And just pointing out that it's about the proficiency and not the correct answer there. And can they make their case for it? That's wonderful. That's to see another thing I hadn't thought of in terms of the assessment piece. So one of the things that I said in our intro is, yes, we're going to talk about bringing art into your curriculum, but also making your room into an art gallery. So what does that look like in practice, and how does it change students' engagement?
As a side note, before becoming a Spanish teacher, I was actually studying arts administration. So I took classes on art gallery management. I remember having to help plan it at my university. So I wanted to bring that into the classroom. The easiest way, and not all teachers have access to the color printer and laminator, but that's the easiest way to get out your color paintings. You can also, if you have Chromebooks in the classroom or laptops, have each one have a painting and display those around the room. That's another quick fix. But display multiple paintings around the room, and your goal is to make it as authentic as possible. So think about what an art gallery looks like. You might see the title next to it. You may even see a short description of the painting, depending on your proficiency level, those students, you may want to add a description. You may just want to put the title. You can think about it in terms of, okay, today we're studying this specific artist. So you put just that artist's work around the room. Maybe you have a condensed art unit and you want to just talk about a bunch of art from your language. Go ahead and just do a variety of artists. That's up to you and your time frame, but you want to make it as authentic as possible.
I like that idea of using technology, a Chromebook or whatever type of technology students have or teachers have access to, because often teachers don't have their own space. They have a shared teaching space and they'll think, but I can't put this up in my room. I don't have time. But if they're doing it using technology, they can travel with them or they can have it on iPads or something like that.
As I was thinking about the shared classroom, I remember my first year, I was on a cart. I was thinking, okay, if you've got desks around the classroom, just put a different piece of artwork on each desk. You don't have to use the walls. It doesn't have to be an art gallery in that sense. But as long as you're still able to try to emulate it, that's best.
Where do you typically find your art that you're using with your students? Are you Googling it or do you have websites that you go to? Where do you typically come across it?
I use Google a lot. So depending on which artist I'm talking about, there's different websites that I don't think they're authentic artist websites, but they've created a compilation of their most famous works. So I usually find those websites. Another website that is really good is the Google Arts and Culture, and they create these collections from each artist. So I use that a lot. Another thing I've been doing is I created a Facebook group called Art and Spanish Class. And one of my things I've been trying to support teachers with is every week I share a different artist with them that's lesser known. So I've been learning a lot and I've created this long spreadsheet and just gathering resources as I find them. So that if you're a Spanish teacher listening, I can help support you in that way. But other than that, I just use a lot of Google.
I will make sure that the link to your Facebook group is in the show notes so teachers can go over and join us there. And I had a whole episode about the Google Arts and Culture app. That was back on episode 196 with Heidi Trude. And I'll make sure that episode is also in the show notes because it really complements doing what we're talking about in a very digital way, virtual way. Do you have any other recommendations for teachers in terms of other websites or places that you continue to learn from where we can continue on our learning journey?
I would say two more that are really good. The first is different museums. So if you're traveling to a country that speaks your language, what museums would you travel to? And I want you to look up those websites because those websites most likely have virtual tours already done. And that saves you time and your students get to go explore at their own pace. The other thing that's really cool for students to see are videos that will show them how big or small those paintings are. And so YouTube is a treasure for this. Just different tourists will share YouTube shorts of them going up to a painting. And you're like, oh, it was that small, or oh my gosh, look at all the people standing in front of this mural. So it helps them to see, okay, because what you're printing off in your classroom is not the actual size of the painting. So a YouTube video can help them to grasp that a little better.
I like that idea of YouTube shorts or whether it's TikTok videos of people in different museums, the actual painting and the size of it. I know every time somebody sees the Mona Lisa, they're always shocked at how small it is. I love these different ideas. My head is swirling with like all these things I want to try out right away and find it. I think I'm going to go down a rabbit hole once I start looking for art. I'm sure that's an issue you've had and everyone's going to have and trying to find all these great things. So we mentioned your Facebook group, but are there other ways that our listeners can be reaching out and connecting with you?
Absolutely. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Learning Llama, and that's 2 L's in learning and 2 in llama. And then my Facebook group is where I'm really trying to share a lot of ideas and to support teachers with art.
I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice as we end our conversation. It could be about using art in the classroom. It could be about teaching, life in general. I always just think it's interesting to have something to ponder as we go through our day. What can you share with us?
I would say that after you've listened to all this, I always had students say, I'm not an artist. And even you might be thinking, I know nothing about art. You don't have to be an artist. You don't even have to be artistic. I can't draw at all. But you don't have to have those skills to enjoy teaching art, to enjoy looking at art. It's what you do with it. It's how you approach it. It's how you make it fun for your students. And if you show them that you are enjoying this and that it's exciting to talk about art, and they will get more out of it.
It's an interesting way to put it, because when we talk about culture, the same thing happens. When we show different cultural experiences and phenomenon to our students, we don't have to be the cultural experts. We're learning sometimes along with them, and the same thing goes for art. So thank you for allowing us to do that and taking the fear of needing to be the expert and learning along with your students, because we are the experts in how they are going to engage with talking about it and reading about it, and their interpretation is up to them. So thank you so much for spending this time with us here today, Courtney, and giving us some really great ideas for bringing art and an art gallery into our classroom. I know that our listeners are walking away with some wonderful ideas to use in their classroom, and that is all thanks to everything you brought with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure to talk with you today.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Courtney Bonino? I hope that you're thinking of some new ways to use art with your students, and maybe even use those pictures on your walls that have mostly just been a decoration until now. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Courtney. And thank you for all that you do on a daily basis to support and motivate your students. I very much appreciate and enjoy supporting you and your language teacher colleagues as you bring effective, proficiency-focused strategies into your classroom. Take a look at the links in the show notes or on my website for details about my in-school workshops, live virtual workshops, self-paced departmental PD, and Ready for Tomorrow quick win courses for individual teachers just like you. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And let's stay connected on social media. You can find me at WL Classroom pretty much everywhere. You'll also find lots of ideas, suggestions, and resources on my website, WLClassroom.com. Now stay curious, keep learning, and continue the great work you do inspiring and supporting your students.